Hello, welcome back to Sextras.
Where we talk about sex and all the extras.
I'm Honey.
And I'm Maria.
And welcome back to our Pleasure and Desire mini-series.
Yeah, psych. We lied about not being in the studio anymore.
Maria came back for the weekend, so we're doing a little impromptu recording session in the studio, which is nice.
Yeah, I thought we'd take advantage.
Yeah. And we are joined by a lovely guest today. Her name is Keeley Rankin, and she is a sex therapist and coach. She specializes in male sexual dysfunction. And we're going to talk to her all about kind of how to communicate what gives you pleasure to a partner and like figuring out what gives you pleasure. We've kind of talked about this quite a few times before when we were like planning what we wanted the next episode of the mini series to be. We were like, okay, we feel like we've talked about our own experiences, like our own problems not being able to communicate things, but like we haven't made the change. We're not the change we want to see in the world. We're not doing it. So yeah, we were like, we should probably get some advice from someone who like actually knows and is actually qualified to give this advice. So yeah, Keeley did that basically.
Yeah, she gives us some good tips. So I hope you guys enjoy the episode.
Yeah. And also if you want to watch the episode, you can go to our Patreon and watch the full video, and you'll also be able to see Keeley as well. So if you're into that, you can join our little community and get a free sticker, get some bonus content, all of that lovely stuff. So yeah,
let's get into it.
Thank you so much for joining us. And we wanted to kind of talk to you a little bit about how to communicate pleasure to a partner. As we were saying, we don't have concrete advice, we just kind of have our own experiences to go off, complain about, but that's not entirely helpful.
Communicating, really.
Yeah. So it would be good to get some advice from someone who's obviously seen a lot of people's problems around sex and what they struggle to communicate, and get real advice that people can implement in their lives.
Yeah. Could you talk to us like a little bit about what you do? How you got into it, I guess, just like a short little summary of...
Yes, so I work as a sex and relationship coach out of San Francisco in the USA, and the way I normally talk about it is that I specialize in pleasure and helping people connect with their pleasure. So that moves all the way from, traumatic experiences and moving past those, blocks, barricades, things that get in the way of us being able to find pleasure, all the way into people who feel like they're having great sex, but they have a sense that it could be better, and finding ways to deepen into that experience. So I work with men, women, and couples. I actually also specialize in male performance struggles, so I have a lot of experience around the male side of what's going on in a primarily heterosexual dynamic.
Okay. And what kind of interested you about the area? Like, how did you kind of think, oh, I want to get into sex therapy?
I honestly try and answer that question a little bit different every time, kind of like a fresh, like, how did I get here today? I grew up riding horses professionally, and when I stopped riding, because I wanted I sort of lost the love for it once I got at the much deeper, doing it every day, 7 days a week level. But I knew the next thing I wanted to do needed to be something I felt really passionate about, because I had been passion driven primarily my whole life. And as I went through like looking at other options for a career, the only book that I could really stay awake reading were books about sex. So I was like, okay, well, I guess I'm doing something in the sex field. And I went and took this really crazy, wild, fun, radical training. It's called sexological bodywork, which is a hands-on moving people through finding their pleasure, basically. And was like, okay, that was really fun, but I think I need a lot of tools. So I went back to school, got my master's, did a bunch of other trainings, and now 12 years later, I find myself still completely mystified and wrapped up in human pleasure, communication, intimacy. I think the most interesting thing about the field, actually, I have a couple of other coaches that work with me now that are under my supervision, and we talk about it a lot. It's like you never reach the end of the things you need to know. I mean, it is an endless space of more information, new information. All of us are so incredibly unique. So even the information that your listeners have heard on here or will hear today, everyone is so different. And so we sort of like we cherry pick from other people and think that it might work for us, and it maybe work for us this one year or in our early 20s, but it won't work for us in our 30s. So it's just a fascinating, wonderful field, I believe. So I feel lucky to be in it.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously agree. We love talking about sex, and learning about people's sex lives gives you such a kind of innate, like, intimate understanding of who they are as a person and what kind of makes us all tick in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's really interesting. What's kind of the main things that, I mean, I guess there's so many issues that come up around sex for people, but what are some of like the most common recurring ones that you see?
I think that a lot of people sell themselves short when it comes to pleasure. I think it's sort of like if I'm having an orgasm or if we're having frequent enough sex, then it's kind of like good enough, or we're getting it right. And I think people get really caught in sort of like trying to check off the boxes for whether or not they're like exploring sexuality in the right way. I think that's one of the places where I really help clients sort of learn how to listen to their own bodies fully, and, which we're talking about today, communicate that to another partner. And there's nonverbal communication, there's verbal communication, there's the timing of communication, how, when, what do we say, what does that look like, all the different pieces to that. But I think ultimately, like when I look back on my 12 years of practice with people and I think about the journey that people go on, I think ultimately it's a decision to turn towards their own pleasure. We could talk about that as self-care, we could talk about it as spirituality. I mean, there's a lot of different ways we can talk about pleasure. But I think that, obviously clients are in my office because they believe they want more, but sometimes they show up for different reasons. Couples show up for various different reasons. Early ejaculators or men struggling with ejaculation control stuff show up for different reasons. But I think that's sort of like maybe the bigger piece that I would say.
And do you think the problems come from like the actual issues with sex themselves? I know you specialize in like sexual dysfunctions, that kind of thing, or is it about the way we talk about sex?
It's holistic. It is all of the above. I think it's societal, it's the way we're raised, it's the family we're raised in, it's religion, it's what our friends are saying. I think there's no one way to say like, oh, it's just this one thing. I think it's so complex. And one of the things that can happen for clients who grow up in homes where they saw their parents really value work or value what's like hard work, like we go to work all day and we do our work and we come home and we do all the chores, and they don't actually witness their parent indulging or enjoying or taking a bath. I mean, little things, not actually like sex related stuff, just pleasure related things, enjoying their food, sitting and relaxing. That can also really lend itself, and a lot of people don't think about that. It's like the environment that the child is actually moving through the world in. Are they witnessing people taking time for their pleasure? And I think that actually has a really, really big impact that doesn't often get talked enough about, especially from a parenting perspective, or from just trying to understand your own disconnection from pleasure, or why you think it's not important, or the way you're sort of thinking about it.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I'd never thought about like just the ways that you like let yourself experience pleasure, like just throughout the day and throughout life, not just in like the when we think about pleasure, like just thinking about like sex straight away. But yeah, I mean, because I guess it's like a two-step process. It's like finding out what like gives you pleasure and then being able to communicate that. What do you think like people struggle most in, or is it sort of like tying the two together? Like what's the disconnect there? Or
I think what's true more often than not, and I this comes up a lot in my couples work, is that a lot of people don't actually know what is pleasurable for them. And I think there can be this belief in a partnership where you're like, my partner's just not telling me what their fantasies are. They're just not telling me what they like. They won't say what they like. I want them to tell me. I think what's more true is honestly, people don't know. And they feel like you get to a certain age or you've dated enough or you've been like, they just should magically know or have known it by now. I hear that a lot. Like, I should just know this by now. I'm in my 30s and I've had so many boyfriends, or I'm married, and I think what's really true is that we, because of the box that sex gets put in and the way, I don't have a problem with porn, but I think it does create some issues around people exploring their pleasure in some regards. In others, it does not. But in some places, it can make people feel like it has to look like porn looks, mainstream porn specifically. And when we apply that to everyone's body, it typically doesn't work because it's this one specific type of sex. There's a woman, her name is Miss Jaya, and she created the erotic blueprints, and they're sort of taking off here in the US. She just had a Netflix series come out, and I think she's in Goop too. Oh yeah, it
Oh
was
yeah,
Goop
I've
that she
seen
was
her
on.
in Goop. Yeah.
Yeah, and she does an amazing job actually talking about, or she has done this incredible job of creating different ways of thinking about pleasure and the different areas and sort of like landscapes, blueprints that people are in. And I think that's really, really helpful in allowing folks to figure out like what are they into in a way that is separate from porn, and like one of the blueprints I think about a lot is it's called the energetic blueprint, which is people who really like eye contact and they really like energy flowing, so you don't even have to have physical touch. It can just be kind of like getting towards and pulling away, and they often maybe will like light feathers or not knowing when contact is coming or not coming, but they have really specific things that are turnoffs for them. Going directly towards genital touch or anything happening too quickly can actually send them the opposite way. And so I think sometimes what happens with people is because we don't talk about pleasure enough, or the types of pleasure or the ways that pleasure can look, and we say, oh, it has to look like this specific thing, people sort of aren't curious enough or don't have the space to be curious enough to find out what actually works for them. And then that second part is like, once I think you figure out what you like, it's often easier to communicate if you have the language. But sometimes people can intuitively feel what they like, but they don't quite have the language. So then the communication gets a little complicated. So
Yeah.
Do you think people are intimidated by like all the options there are for ways to experience pleasure? Do you think they kind of are aware of, as you're saying, the different blueprints, like energetic, or I can't remember what the other categories are? Or do you think that they just like, they don't know at all?
No, I think what you're saying is like, is it that is it like they get overwhelmed maybe, or they're,
Yeah, do they get everyone? Because it's hard to kind of go from like zero to something, you know?
right, right. Yeah, I think that's probably a personality type, right? Like the way we lean into learning new things or not, does it feel like, oh, this is fun and I'm curious and I want to explore and I can't wait to see what's on the other side? Or is it, I should have already had this figured out. Learning is a little scary because I've got to get it right and it has to be perfect. And I think with
Right.
sex, a lot of people, specifically in the US too, really come from this like work, perfectionism, get it right. And what's true about sex is there is no getting it right. Like an orgasm isn't even getting it right. I mean, there's an orgasm can happen. It doesn't necessarily mean you got it right because there is no right. The question of what is pleasurable in a long-term sustainable way within your body, where you're communicating and moving through ups and downs and feeling close to whomever you're choosing to have sex with, whether that's just a one night stand closeness or that's a long-term partnership. It's really this question of like, what is it looking like in the landscape, not necessarily focusing like on one thing like the orgasm or something like that. So I think it can definitely be tricky and probably very overwhelming to not know where to start from and how to start, for sure. I think that could definitely be an experience for many people.
So what are some ways that some people can sort of like start finding out what they actually find pleasurable? And yeah.
When I talk about people learning pleasure in their bodies, I normally map it onto, I make a big circle and I divide it into thirds. And so there's 3 parts. One part is erotic embodiment or physical sensation. So it's how is touch feeling in your body, the types of touch that you like, the sensations that you want to experience. Another section is relationships or intimacy. So it's who and how are you connecting with your heart. So it's that place of, when I think people typically think of sex, they're like, oh, I love that person, so I have sex with them. That's that category that people typically go to. It's a how are we open to in our experience of letting someone close to us. And then there's another category, which is fantasy or anticipation, creativity. And that's sort of the space of how are we allowing ourselves to think about things that are sexy, that turn us on. So we think when we talk about pleasure, we have to look at all 3 of those and see sort of like, where are we heavily leaning into? What's an easy space for us? Where do we naturally go? And then what are the other 2 places that we want to explore a little bit? The sensation stuff really comes down to, I believe, being curious about different types of touch. And it depends when I work with clients whether or not I'll give them specific things to try. It sort of depends where we're starting from. But a lot of times I think it's really like saying, take 20 or 30 minutes and just explore different experiences within your body, whether that's moving your body or touching your body and different types of touching. But what's true is, like, if people just hand you over like a list of things to do, sure, you can run through those and see what's pleasurable, but ultimately what we want to create is a level of curiosity within yourself to follow what is actually interesting and know how to move into and out of pleasure when it comes to sensation. And then that top category, which is that fantasy category, or the third one I was drawn on the top of my circle, is fantasy is a really, really interesting space to explore in terms of how people allow themselves to stay sexually excited for a long-term, in a long-term relationship. You actually need quite a bit of fantasy, I believe. Because if you think about when you first meet someone and you're in new relationship energy, there is so much excitement there, but you are totally in fantasy about that person. I mean, you don't really know anything about them. You're imagining all these different things. You maybe even haven't seen their body yet, but you're imagining what it would be like. And you've really created so much anticipation. The first date, the first couple of dates. Are we going to go home together? What's it going to be like to kiss this person? There is full of anticipation, which creates a lot of erotic energy, a lot of interest. You spend time shaving or whatever you do to get ready for your date, and you pick the date and you ask the person a week before if they want to go, and there's texting and you're telling your friends, right? There's so much energy that actually goes into that. And so when I think about the fantasy category, that is the sort of same energy that we're trying to tap into. And in the realm of fantasy, if you cut a circle in half, so we have like a bottom line for listeners who aren't able to watch us in person. If you imagine, to the left is things you want to do before you die, and to the right is things you never want to do. You have no interest in exploring it. There is a whole array of fantasies in between that are sort of like, maybe I want to do it, I'm not really sure. And I think that's where the communication actually gets more complicated. So communicating touch, types of touch, I think that is a little bit easier. Like if we go back to the other category of sensation, I like my hair pulled, I like light feather touch. I think that is often a slightly less vulnerable type of communication, although very important to get the touches that we want. But when we start to communicate around the fantasies that live inside of our brain that are only ours, that's, I believe, where people start to feel very shameful or scared or worried. What's my partner going to think? That I want to be dressed like a baby, or I want to be, there's a whole range of things that people are sexually interested in that may only take to a BDSM club or may only take to a professional sex worker, that never get to enter into their relationship. And when I think about like complicated ways of communicating, I know we're maybe veering away from the average person, but when I think about the complicated ways of communicating, those are the places where it gets a little bit tricky, because you have to decide, is it safe in this relationship to share this fantasy? Is my partner going to shame me? Is this an okay place for me? And there's a level of assessing that, I believe, in learning to communicate, that everybody has to make.
So how much of like figuring out what you personally enjoy comes from yourself, and how much of it comes from a partner, or at least in your experience of like listening to people's experiences, how much of it is from each?
I think there's some coaches, therapists who might say like you need to figure it out all on your own. I think both are valuable. The type in my experience, every new relationship is going to create new energy that's going to open up new territory for you and close off potentially old territory. So maybe you had a partner that you loved light touch with, you loved gentle stroking, you liked long buildups, and then you meet a new partner and all you want to do is kind of pull hair and choke and bite each other. I mean, people's energy impacts us in different ways. So it comes down to, can we have that curiosity about ourselves? Can we have that curiosity about our partners, about our relationship, and keep exploring what feels good and let go of what we're supposed to want and move into what is here in this moment. And that's, I think, what we're sort of building up to is like, how do we start to talk about that? And I think the first place that I normally recommend with people, especially if I'm working with them individually and they have an already existing partnership that they're not bringing in to do couples work, is like, we don't want to talk about this, especially if we've never talked about it in the moment. So it's not like we've been together for 2 years and suddenly you're about to go down on me and I'm like, hey, let's talk about this thing. That's really not a great time. Not because we don't want to talk about it, but people tend to feel a little more vulnerable in the moments that they're starting to explore, like physically moving into erotic spaces. And so if it hasn't been something that's existed in your couple till right now, we would want it to be something that's introduced outside of the dynamic of a highly pressured or a dynamic that could essentially could trigger that person. So I think of it as like, what is fair in terms of bringing it up. So it would be something like, it would be outside of being in sex and be like, hey, I listened to this podcast the other day and there were these really interesting topics about sex. I wonder when a good time this week would be for us to sit down and talk about it. That's sort of best case scenario, especially for a couple who maybe hasn't talked about sex a lot or feels like their partner may need some time to prepare. Because what's true is there are people where, like us ladies, it's easy to talk about sex, but for a lot of people, it's really scary and it's really hard, and they need some time to prepare for the conversation. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that they'll never get to a place where it's comfortable. It just means that right now that's where they are. And so that's where we're starting from. And so we don't ever want to push anybody into a place that they're not ready to go, because that just makes them put up more walls and feel more defended and more scared. So it's like, hey, can we talk about this? Like, and you could even send this podcast or anything else that you've read or listened to. Like, could you check this out? I'd love to discuss this. One of the things that I often say to people is when we start to have these conversations, this is like just a personal pet peeve. It's like, we don't go into them saying, oh, hey, so I've been learning all about fantasies. Tell me your fantasies. Because it takes all of the vulnerability off of you and it puts everything on your partner who knew nothing about any of this happening. We say, hey, I've been learning a lot about fantasies and I've been thinking about mine. I'd love to know what yours are as you think about them. Do you feel ready or comfortable or interested in hearing about some of mine? And you go first as the person bringing it up.
Mm.
You take the first steps to say, I've been thinking about this and I've been interested in this. And have you ever thought about this, or would you ever want to try this? And again, everybody's starting from a very different place. So it may be like, hey, how do you feel about threesomes? Or it may be like, hey, how do you feel about having sex in the shower? Like, there's so many variations of where couples are starting from, the type of communication the levels of communication that we're talking about. But I think one of the biggest, most important parts is being vulnerable first and showing your partner that that is an okay place to be. And then after that happens, not expecting anything back from them potentially for a while. So it means you share what your fantasies are and they do what they do with it. We hope that they say, thank you for telling me. That's really interesting to know. And they ask more questions about it. But if they don't, we just have to hold that this is where they're at, they're learning. And over time, you can start to create that dynamic where, hey, it'd feel really great when I told you these things. If you just, even if you're not interested, you said, thanks for sharing or something like that. But eventually, depending on the partner's response, we may have to say, like, hey, I'd really love to know about some of yours when you're ready. Some people will share right back, and other people will feel like, oh, I'm not ready yet. I don't feel comfortable, or I'm not sure if this is a safe space, or I think you might judge me, or I don't, I've never told anyone this, so I don't know what you'll do with the information. And so that's sort of like where we start the process from, and then we just go from there and see what happens, basically.
I think what people are like most worried about, or maybe this is just me, when expressing what gives them pleasure, is like the other person being kind of completely closed off to the idea or disgusted in the worst instances, I guess. Is there any way that you can be sexually incompatible, or is it for everyone a process that one day you will reach a good place of communicating?
People are definitely sexually incompatible. There is no doubt about that. And that's a really, really tough thing when people want completely different experiences in the bedroom. And navigating around that and figuring out how to move through that can be complex. And sometimes it can mean that that couple outsources sex, that they're not having sex with you, they're staying committed in the relationship, physically there, emotionally there, but sexually they may be having sex outside of that relationship because they can't get their needs met. The disgust response is a really, really interesting one. And I think, it could be interesting for you to look back in your history and see where maybe someone showed disgust or disdain or shamed you for just basic pleasures, even if it just goes back to like, I want cereal in the morning, and someone was like, cereal's gross or something like that. In a healthy dynamic, couples hold their own reaction to someone sharing about something that they're not interested in. And it's more like, wow, thank you for telling me. That's really interesting. I'll have to think about how I feel about that. Or, wow, I feel really scared. Or, I feel worried you're going to want me to do that. Or, I'm not sure if I'd feel comfortable with that. So, there's language that gets created after we hold space. And I think one of the things that's really important with communicating is just because we're asking for it, it doesn't mean our partner has to give it, number one. So just because your partner asks you for something doesn't mean you have to give it. This is about pleasure, so it's about doing what you want. And hopefully you have these conversations prior to making a decision about long-term commitment with somebody, because it does get more complicated when we hold these things in and then we get married, and a couple years into marriage and kids and complicatedness, we go suddenly, I want this thing. And our partner is like, whoa, no way, that freaks me out. I could never give that to you. That is a complicated space. So I normally encourage people who are dating, it's like, get to know this person, slowly let them know the things that you're interested in. It doesn't have to be all at once. It doesn't have to be the scariest thing at first. It's a process of building the relationship and assessing if this is the right person to go fully down that space with. And getting to that, though, I would say within the first 2 years, to assess whether or not that person can meet you sexually. And that depends on each person's needs. Like, I've worked with clients who have like really strong fetish stuff going on that they have had their whole lives, but they're in their 40s or 50s or something, later in life and middle life. Sorry, everyone out there, not later in life, but like they've been sexual for a while.
Yeah.
And they haven't shared in many, many relationships. And it's tricky because sometimes that stuff, there's a weird way in which it's staying secret is actually more fun than sharing it. And so I think everyone has to make some decisions around that too, of like, is some of this stuff, is it so scary to share that you're keeping it private because you don't want to be shamed or someone else to be disgusted? Or is it that you actually want to keep something private? Esther Perel, who's that amazing sex therapist in New York City, she talks about a secret garden. And that some people like to have a secret garden, and when you take that away from them, something about their sexuality kind of like goes out the window. And so I think there's also assessing for that. I don't believe everything has to be told. It's really Do you want to share this? Do you want to be met in this? Do you want your partner to know? And again, if we go back to that half circle, the left and right, it's like, is that something you have to do before you die? Or is it just something that you're turned on thinking about, but you know you're never, ever going to want to do in person? So maybe you have a fantasy about being gangbanged at the bus stop. Most people are probably never going to actually do that specific fantasy just simply because it's illegal, I would say, in general, like having sex in public and random people walking by. But
Yeah.
you may fantasize a lot about that. And it may be really sexy and really turn you on. And there's a way that you can actually create a story in the safety of your bedroom with a trusting and loving partner where you play that out. You could even have other people come in depending on the dynamics of your couple. So there's ways to navigate around things even if you're not actually going to do stuff. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. And
Okay.
what about, because you said that obviously our sexuality kind of changes over time. So
Yes.
then what if you are in a long-term relationship and then something comes up and you're kind of unsure of, like, it's completely different to anything you've kind of done before? How would you recommend bringing that up?
Yes, right. So one person starts to go on the journey of discovering sexuality. This happens a lot. The other person doesn't really know this is happening. And suddenly they start to find out lots of things, and they've been in a long term relationship where they felt close and sexually connected. And again, I think it is about, every person is so different. So people will do different things with this. But I think in general, it's about slowly giving information and giving your partner time to catch up. So we see this a lot in the Bay Area actually with non-monogamy. Suddenly one person's like been listening to all the non-monogamy podcast, and non-monogamy is like you have a normally you're in a couple, which is called a primary relationship, and then one person decides I want to have sex with other people or have relationships with other people. And so one person in that partnership will have been doing all this research, like reading books and listening to podcasts and talking to different people and like reading all the Reddit forums. And the other person has no idea this is even happening. And then suddenly that person goes, I want to have non-monogamy. Let's have a non-monogamous relationship. Like, let's be poly or let's do something. And the other partner is like, whoa, I have no idea what we're even talking about. Like how, what, and that the other person who's brought it up has been spending 6 months, 3 years, 5 years researching, thinking, and then they're suddenly like can't hold it anymore and they explode and they ask for this thing. So this could be really anything, right? Someone's been thinking for a long time about something they want to try and they've been withholding it or not sharing it with their partner. And I think sometimes that happens. And what we need to do as the person asking for that is to really hold space for our partner to get a grasp on the thing that we're asking and to give them space and time to integrate the new information. It can be a surprise, and people do lots of different things with the feeling of being surprised. They can get angry, they can get scared, they can acquiesce and say, okay, let's just do it. We're just going to do this non-monogamy thing because you're asking for it and I've got to give you what you want, even though that's not really what they want, or they have a lot of questions or they need to slow down. So I think it really comes down to asking a lot of questions, and nothing is urgent. I think that's another really big piece here around communicating. I think sometimes when we start to tell our partner stuff, it's like, okay, I'm going to tell you this and now we got to do it. Or like, now we got to make something happen. And it's like, just take a deep breath. Nothing has to happen today. We're just starting the conversation. Again, remember, we're starting it outside of the bedroom. No one's clothes are off, most likely. So it's like, it's okay. We're just starting this conversation. And I would say if you get, 3-6 months in and the conversation isn't going anywhere and you don't think you're making movement or it's causing friction, that's where it's a really great idea to maybe reach out for some help. Get some professional help to navigate what's going on. But most people don't hear new information that's been withheld from them well the first time. They're like, whoa, why didn't you tell me? This is confusing. I feel caught off guard. Another one I'll hear a lot is like in the beginning of the relationship, because there was so much new relationship energy and so much anticipation, oral sex becomes a big one. Like one person's like, suddenly a couple years in, they're like, I hate the way my partner goes down on me. I hate it. Like, I don't like it. But then they just don't say anything because they don't want to hurt their partner's feelings and they hadn't said anything before. And now suddenly when that person doesn't want to do it anymore and it becomes this whole thing. And this can go on for like years and years and years. And so, how do we break the news of information to someone that actually what we've been doing isn't right for me and I don't like it and I haven't liked it?
Mm.
And that level of truth and transparency and honesty can be very difficult at first. So, we want to always deliver information in a loving and kind way while being honest and straightforward. Because we get in a tricky situation where we start to be honest, but then we pull back because we get scared we're going to hurt our partner's feelings. And it may hurt their feelings. That's true. And you probably didn't mean to hurt their feelings. That's also probably true. And that's okay that their feelings are hurt. But the process is, how do we begin to move forward from there, even if their feelings are hurt?
Yeah. So what would you say, like, what is actually like a kind way of like sort of breaking those kinds of news?
The ice on that. Yeah, normally the way it looks is something like, hey, there's something I want to talk to you about in our personal sexual life. Let me know when is a good time. Some people will go like, right now is a good time. And other people will be like, okay, I'll let you know. And then they'll bring it up later. And I think I think if you're aware that your partner may get hurt, I think a great way to start that conversation is to say, like, hey, I'm going to tell you something. My intention is not to hurt you. I know that this might, and I really don't want to. So if I say something in a hurtful way, please know that it's not my intention. Maybe, it could be I'm really nervous, or I feel afraid to talk about this, or it's just uncomfortable for me. So you give them a little bit of, you give yourself a little bit of space to say, like, I don't have to get this perfect, because no one gets any communication perfect. And the expectation that it's going to be perfect will keep you from having these types of conversations. So it's saying something like a preface of what your intention is. And then it would be something like, I've not been really wanting you to go down on me lately. And I want to tell you that I haven't really enjoyed it for the last couple of years. And I'm sorry that I haven't told you, but I was scared to hurt your feelings. And now I want us to change this so that we can engage in that sex act with each other in a pleasurable way. And then it really depends where the partner goes from there. But it's not about a fight. You're on the same team. It's about advocating for your pleasure. And if you hold the space of your sex is always changing, your pleasure is always changing, the things you are always changing, then you're constantly in communication with your partner about that. It's when we hold this idea of like, I like this particular type of lick and touch and feel and squeeze, that it gets more complicated because there isn't the room to keep having conversation around that.
Yeah, and like you don't always, even if like let's say you're really aware about what you like it's not that every time you have sex you're gonna want the same thing. Like you're not always in the same mood and
Exactly.
whatever. So do you have
Uh-huh.
any advice for like day to day always communication during sex? Like not the like okay let's sit down when we're both clothed kind of conversation. More
Mm-hmm. Right.
like
Less
communication or
serious.
and cues to like show someone like
Yes.
what to do and like what you like and like specifically if you're like really shy and embarrassed about that you don't want to like say like
Right. There's two places here. There's the nonverbal communication and the verbal
mm,
communication. So the nonverbal communication is about breath, noise like moans, and body movement. And I would say to someone who that sounds like a totally new territory, start with breath. When your partner's touching you, if there's something that they like, take deeper, more full breaths. Really big. When pleasure comes, take a big breath. Your partner will notice it.
mm,
People are very tuned into each other in these moments. Once that starts to feel comfortable, try making a little bit of noise, right? So that's the any exhale noise is really helpful. Ah. Because it's so new for people sometimes who are not making any noise, specifically men. Men typically stay very, very quiet during sex.
mm.
It's
It can be hard to get. Yeah, it's wild. I think they're traumatized from porn actually,
yeah.
because porn actors make noises that don't feel connected. So that's my personal point of view on that. But starting to try to make some noise, just getting it out. And it will feel really awkward at first. I think that's what's true about learning new things in the body. It will feel so weird and uncomfortable, but I promise over time, if you keep connecting it with pleasure, when something feels good, I make a noise, it will start to feel more normal. Then the last one is movement. So as something comes across your body, something feels good, you let other parts or maybe even that part move, you breathe, you make a noise, right? That really starts that non-verbal communication to your partner of like, I'm in this feels good, I'm enjoying what we're experiencing. And that one is slightly easier, in all honesty, than the verbal one. The verbal space of using language during sex is really, really hard for many, many people. I'd say like 85-90% of people really struggle to get words out of their mouth during sex, especially words that are used, in the bedroom, which I call them like your undressed words. So you undress your body, and we want to also undress your words. So it's like, what are we saying to our partner? We're not going to be talking the same way in the same tone with obviously the same words in an office space. We want to really shift the way we start to communicate that. I would say the first step is just getting comfortable with those words. So if you're not comfortable playing with your partner with those words, that would be a great place to start. You can try with a friend, or even just try in front of the mirror, saying naughty, dirty, playful, sexy parts of the body, boobs. Am I allowed to say that? Are we
Yeah,
okay with
yeah.
whatever words?
You can
Okay.
say whatever you want.
Pussy, cock, asshole, like try, fuck, like standing in front of the mirror and just practicing saying these words, because we don't say them very often. Like we're just not walking around saying that very often. We have to practice using that. And then eventually moving into sexy sentences, starting small and then moving up, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So that could be in front of the mirror. That could be with friends. That could be with your lover. Then the piece of how do we communicate when we want something? And I normally talk about it in general. This is a business term, I believe, the sandwiching, which is if we're wanting to make a correction on our partner, we try to find something that we enjoyed in the last couple of minutes. I really like the way you nibbled my neck. When you bite down, it startles me and I don't really enjoy it that much. I wonder if we can go back to the nibbles. So something we enjoyed, giving the correction, and then a direction to go.
Okay.
So I really love when you were teasing me with your tongue, but when you stick your tongue down my throat, it just doesn't turn me on. I wonder if we can go back to the teasing. I think that's a really, really good way to redirect and to often lower your tone, take a deep breath before you deliver it, and really emphasize, because people can be so caught up in what they're doing and feeling like, oh, I'm this great lover, or I'm trying to give you this thing and I'm showing you my desire for you. So the course correction can sometimes feel difficult for people, like, oh, I'm doing it wrong. And that's why we really want to emphasize you have to really be connected to the thing that you liked before.
Okay.
Right? It was really sexy when you did this. What we're doing here isn't quite right, whatever that is. Can we go back to this, or can we try this? Does that feel helpful?
Yeah, that's really helpful. And just to kind of like sum up the episode, could we just kind of do a little timeline of like if there's some people who feel like they're a complete beginner? So like for a relationship, you said from the beginning, kind of make sure you can tell that the other person can give you what you need, and it's all about building it up day by day. But what would be like a really easy, like low stakes kind of first conversation to have? Could you give an example of what that might look like?
I think in a new couple, a good first conversation to have is actually just to be curious about that person's sexual experiences. And not necessarily like who have they had sex with before, although that is also very interesting and helpful. What was pleasurable for them, or what have their experiences been like? But also like what were their experiences in childhood? I think starting in a new relationship to open up the conversation about sex and who we are sexually can lend itself to a lot of ease as we move forward, right? Like, oh, I grew up in a household where my mom always walked around naked and she had her lovers around all the time. And it was really uncomfortable for me. And I always felt like sex needed to be behind closed doors and it needed to have this and that. Someone over rigidified out of being in a really relaxed environment where there was no safety. So it tells you a lot about potential places that people may be triggered or over boundaried given what their childhood was like. And it also just opens up that level of vulnerability and intimacy, which I think is really, really important in the long-term space of being able to be sexually connected and communicative.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess it's important to sort of like set that precedent of talking, of having these conversations and like building on that. And as you said before, like setting up sort of like a place where it's comfortable to sort of have those conversations and it's not so like difficult every time, you know, if you just set that precedent from the start. But yeah, thank you so much for all your advice and your tips and your examples. Like they've been really, really helpful.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I feel like we're Generation Z, unfortunately, but I mean, not unfortunately, but sometimes. And I feel like we're quite well versed as a generation in terms of like talking about sex. Like we're a lot more open than other generations in some ways, but also I sometimes the conversations that we have aren't necessarily that constructive. Like I find that even with us, we talk about sex obviously a lot on the podcast and like just amongst friends, you have these conversations of like, oh, but like what happened, and you know, you want to get the full debrief. But it's actually like finding a constructive way to have those conversations and make yourself and the other person feel comfortable actually in the moment and just in general in the relationship. So you've been
we're getting
really
better
helpful.
at talking about sex, but not with the person we should be talking about sex with.
Exactly. Pretty much.
Well, I will say too, one of the things also, it's like we're talking mostly about communicating when things are not going right, but I think another place where people really underemphasize is communicating in the moment when it feels really good. So that's where we were talking a little bit with the nonverbal and the breath, but you know, the verbal communication piece is a huge one, so it's hard to reach in this short period of time. But I think another tidbit I want to throw in here is like, if you're engaging in an experience and it feels really good, try to find the words to say, I really like that. That feels great. Because your partner will be like, yay, I got it right, or we're doing it and you're enjoying this. So that's a really helpful too.
Right, yeah, everyone wants to feel kind of like they're doing a good job. That's all we're really here for. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, well, thank you again. This has been really helpful. And do you want to kind of plug where people can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, so you can find me, most of my stuff is going to be on my website, which is my first and last name, KeeleyRankin.com, KeeleyRankin. And there's all sorts of different things on there. I've got online courses and lots of blog posts, fun stuff. And then if you want to follow me on social media, it's also just my name, Keeley Rankin Sex Coach. So I'd love to have you come over there and see me.
Great.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm sure people will come and check you out. And again, thank you so much for giving us your time.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to Keeley for joining us for this episode. We hope you guys enjoyed and found it useful. I definitely found it very useful. And yeah, please go check her out on her website and everything she mentioned. And as always, you know where you can find us: Facebook, Instagram, TikTok at Sextras Podcast, our website, sextraspodcast.com. And you can join our Patreon. We'll link it in the description. And
definitely come join the family.
And if you want to get in contact with us, you can also email us at sextraspodcast@gmail.com.
And hope you guys are enjoying the Pleasure and Desire miniseries, and definitely keep an eye out for the episodes that are coming next.
We'll see you very, very soon.
Bye.
You've been listening to Sextras, presented by Honey Jane Wyatt and Maria Jose Hayodatiyi. Produced by Mabel Productions.